crash-landing into fate. Ronan trudged through the dense, moonlit forest, the crisp night air biting against his skin. He had been hiking for hours, following the strange streak of fire that had torn across the sky earlier. When the explosion followed minutes later, he knew it wasn't a meteor. Something, or someone, had come crashing down. As he stepped over the charred remains of broken branches and smoking debris, his breath caught in his throat. In the center of a blackened crater, nestled between twisted metal and glowing embers, lay a sleek, silver escape pod. And inside, motionless, was a woman. A mysterious survivor. Ronan hesitated for only a second before rushing forward. The pod's hatch had been torn open from the impact, leaving jagged edges along its rim. Smoke curled into the night air as he reached inside, carefully pulling the unconscious figure into his arms. She wasn't human. Her skin had a faint, ethereal glow, shifting between deep blue and silver under the starlight. Intricate markings ran along her arms, pulsing dimly, as if they responded to his touch. Her features were sharp and delicate, her long, dark hair tangled from the crash. But she was alive, barely. Ronan's heart pounded. He didn't know who she was or why she had fallen from the sky, but one thing was certain, she needed help. Without another thought, he lifted her and carried her away from the wreckage. The long night. Back at his cabin, Ronan laid her down on his makeshift cot. He worked quickly, bandaging the deep gash along her arm and checking for any other injuries. Though he wasn't a doctor, his years as a mechanic had taught him enough about fixing things, including people. As he cleaned her wounds, she stirred, murmuring something in a language he didn't recognize. Her eyes fluttered open. Deep violet, filled with confusion and fear. "Easy," Ronan said softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. She flinched, pushing herself against the wall, her breath shallow. "Who? Where?" Her voice was hoarse, her accent unlike anything he had ever heard. Ronan kept his voice steady. "You crashed. I found you in the woods and brought you here." She studied him, her eyes darting around the room before settling on the window. "My ship." Ronan hesitated. "It's not in good shape. But we can talk about that later. You need to rest." She didn't argue, exhaustion dragging her back into unconsciousness. Ronan sat back, exhaling. Who was she? Where had she come from? And more importantly, what had she been running from? A dangerous arrival. The next morning, Ronan woke to the soft hum of electronics. He turned to see his mysterious guest standing beside the old radio he had salvaged, her fingers skimming over its worn dials. Her posture was tense, her movements precise, as if she were searching for something. "Looking for a distress signal?" Ronan asked, leaning against the wall. She stiffened, glancing at him before shaking her head. "No, that would be a mistake." Ronan frowned. "Why?" Before she could answer, a sharp beep echoed through the cabin. Ronan's gut twisted. Someone was scanning for signals. His radio had picked up an encrypted transmission, a signal bouncing between satellites, searching. Searching for her. The woman's face paled. "They found me. On the run." Ronan didn't ask who they were. The urgency in her voice was enough. Grabbing his gear, he moved quickly, packing whatever supplies they might need. "We need to go." "Now," he said. The woman hesitated, then nodded. Outside, the distant hum of approaching aircraft sent a chill down his spine. Whoever was after her, they weren't far. As they slipped into the shadows of the forest, Ronan had one thought racing through his mind. He had saved her life. But now, he might have just entangled his own fate with hers. Secrets of the Lost Star. The crisp night air carried the distant hum of approaching aircraft. Ronan's grip tightened around the strap of his bag as he moved swiftly through the dense forest, his mysterious companion trailing just behind him. He still didn't know her name. He still didn't know what, or who, was chasing her. But he knew one thing for certain: if they didn't leave now, neither of them would live to find out. A desperate escape. "How many are after you?" Ronan asked in a hushed voice as they weaved through the towering trees. The woman's violet eyes flickered with uncertainty. "More than we can fight." Not exactly the reassuring answer he was hoping for. Ronan's cabin was already far behind them, but the enemy wouldn't need long to track them. His only advantage was knowing these woods like the back of his hand. He had spent years working in isolation, fixing abandoned tech and salvaging old machinery. But this? This was way beyond his usual problems. "There's an old research station a few miles from here," Ronan said. "It's abandoned. We can hide there and figure out our next move." She hesitated. "You're risking too much." Too late for second thoughts, he shot back. "You need a place to lay low. Unless you've got a better plan?" Her expression hardened, but she nodded. "Fine. Lead the way." The hidden past. By the time they reached the rusted-out shell of the research station, the moon was high overhead. Vines had begun reclaiming the building, creeping over shattered windows and collapsed walls. Ronan pushed open the heavy metal door, stepping into the dust-filled darkness. He grabbed a flashlight from his pack and clicked it on, illuminating the long-forgotten remains of desks, flickering monitors, and exposed wiring. The woman followed cautiously, her gaze scanning the room with sharp precision. "This place," she murmured. "It's primitive, but functional." Ronan raised an eyebrow. "Thanks, I guess." She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "You've helped me. You deserve answers." Ronan crossed his arms, waiting. She took a slow breath before speaking. "My name is Nix. I was a scientist. But I was also something more." Ronan frowned. "A scientist from where?" She hesitated, then pressed her fingers against a small metallic device on her wrist. A soft glow spread across her skin as a holographic image flickered to life, a sprawling cityscape, unlike anything Ronan had ever seen. Towering structures of light and metal stretched toward the sky, hovering vehicles weaving between them. "Not from this world," Nick said quietly. Ronan exhaled sharply. "You're an alien." "Yes." He ran a hand through his hair. "Great. That's just great." As if crash landing in his backyard wasn't enough, now he was harboring an extraterrestrial fugitive. The stolen knowledge. "There's more," Nix continued. She tapped the device again, and the image shifted, this time displaying a glowing, cube-like structure. "This is why they're hunting me," she said. Ronan studied the projection. "What is it?" "A core of knowledge. My people store our history, technology, and research within these devices." "So you're carrying one?" She nodded. "I was part of a rebellion against the empire that controls my homeworld. They wanted to use our research for war. I refused. I stole this core to keep it from them. And now they won't stop until they have it back." Ronan let out a low whistle. "So, let me get this straight. You're a runaway scientist carrying top-secret alien tech, and an entire empire is hunting you down? That sums it up." He shook his head. "Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Unwelcome visitors." Before he could process it all, a sharp beeping noise filled the air. Nix tensed, her fingers darting to her wrist device. "They're close," she whispered. Ronan swore under his breath. "We need to move. Now." But before they could slip out the back entrance, a blinding blue light filled the room. A hovering drone emerged from the shadows, scanning them with an eerie hum. Ronan barely had time to react before Nix grabbed his wrist and yanked him behind a fallen desk. Stay down, she hissed. The drone pulsed, its glowing eye flickering as it transmitted something in a language Ronan didn't understand. And then... boom! The wall behind them exploded, sending debris flying. Ronan coughed, his ears ringing. Through the dust, he saw dark figures stepping through the wreckage, their armor gleaming under the light of the drone. Mercenaries. Armed and deadly. The chase begins. Nyx grabbed Ronan's arm. Run. They bolted through the research station, dodging gunfire as energy blasts scorched the walls around them. Ronan didn't dare look back. He had no idea how he got dragged into this mess. But one thing was clear, this wasn't just about survival anymore. Whatever Nyx was carrying, it was worth dying for. And Ronan wasn't about to let her face it alone. Hunted by shadows. The night had turned against them. Ronan and Nyx ran through the ruins of the research station, their breath ragged, their footsteps barely audible over the distant hum of the mercenaries' drones. The cold air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burnt metal. Every instinct in Ronan's body screamed at him to stop, to hide, but he knew that wasn't an option. Not anymore. Nyx gripped his wrist tightly, her violet eyes glowing faintly in the dark. She moved with the kind of grace that suggested she had done this before, escaping, running, surviving. Ronan wasn't so lucky. We need to lose them, she whispered. Ronan shot her a look. Yeah? You think? Before she could reply, another blast rang out behind them. The mercenaries weren't far. A dangerous gamble. They reached the edge of a collapsed hallway. Jagged metal and broken glass littered the ground, blocking their path. Dead end, Ronan muttered, scanning for another exit. Nyx's gaze darted upward. A half-shattered ventilation shaft clung to the ceiling, its opening just big enough for them to squeeze through. Give me a boost, she ordered. Ronan hesitated. Are you serious? She shot him a glare. No time. Help me up. With a grunt, Ronan cupped his hands and lifted her. She hoisted herself into the vent, then reached down to pull him up. Just as he grabbed the edge, the mercenaries burst into the room. A voice, sharp and mechanical, barked an order. Seize them. The first encounter. Blaster fire erupted. Ronan yelped as a bolt of energy seared the metal just inches from his fingers. Nyx gritted her teeth and yanked him upward with surprising strength. They tumbled into the shaft, just as more shots rang out below them. Ronan groaned. You could have given me a warning. Nyx smirked. Would it have helped? He scowled but didn't argue. They crawled through the narrow space, the walls trembling with every explosion from below. Ronan exhaled sharply. Who are these guys? Hunters, Nyx said. Not from my world, but paid to track me down. Ronan frowned. So we're dealing with alien bounty hunters? She nodded grimly. Great, he muttered. Just great. A deadly revelation. They crawled until the shaft opened into another section of the ruins. Nyx dropped down first, landing in a crouch. Ronan followed, dusting himself off. They had ended up in a vast underground chamber. Rusted consoles lined the walls, and cables snaked across the floor like veins. Nyx's gaze locked onto something in the center of the room, a large cylindrical structure, humming with an eerie blue glow. Her expression darkened. We need to leave, she said, stepping back. Ronan frowned. What is that? Nyx hesitated. A conduit. An old relay station. It might still be transmitting. Ronan crossed his arms. Transmitting what? She didn't answer. Before he could press her further, a deep metallic voice echoed through the chamber. There is no escape. The arrival of the enforcer. A massive figure emerged from the shadows, a towering alien clad in dark armor, his glowing red eyes locked onto them. Ronan's stomach twisted. Who the hell is that? Nyx's face had gone pale. Valkyr, she whispered. Ronan had no idea who that was, but from the sheer terror in her voice, he knew one thing: this wasn't just another mercenary. Valkyr stepped forward, his voice a deep, mechanical growl. "Give me the core," he commanded. "Or I will take it from your corpse." Nyx's hands balled into fists. Ronan swallowed. Yeah, this was bad. Really, really bad. The price of the past. Cornered by a nightmare. Ronan's breath hitched as he took an involuntary step back. Valkyr's towering frame cast long shadows across the ruined chamber, his crimson eyes burning like twin embers in the dark. The air crackled with raw energy, a predator's presence pressing down on them like an invisible weight. "The core," Valkyr repeated, his deep mechanical voice void of emotion. "Hand it over." Nyx stood her ground, fists clenched at her sides. "It's not yours to take." Ronan's mind raced. What core? What was she talking about? Before he could ask, Valkyr moved. Faster than something his size should have been capable of, he lunged. A desperate escape. Nyx shoved Ronan aside just as Valkyr's massive hand swiped through the air where he had been standing. The force of it sent debris flying, a chunk of metal grazing Ronan's arm. He barely had time to react before Nyx grabbed his wrist and bolted. "Run," she shouted. Ronan didn't need to be told twice. They sprinted down the length of the ruined chamber, weaving between fallen beams and shattered consoles. Behind them, Valkyr followed, his heavy footfalls shaking the ground. Too fast. They wouldn't make it. Nyx suddenly veered left, dragging Ronan toward a half-collapsed corridor. She slammed her palm against a rusted control panel, and with a screech, a blast door started to lower. But Valkyr was too close. With a roar, he reached out, his massive hand nearly closing around Nyx's throat. A hidden power awakens. Time slowed. A strange glow flickered across Nyx's skin, veins of light pulsing beneath her flesh, energy rippling outward in waves. Her violet eyes darkened, shifting into something unnatural. Then she moved. In a blink, she twisted free from Valkyr's grasp, her body flickering like a mirage. Before he could react, she thrust out her hand, an unseen force slammed into Valkyr's chest, sending him hurtling backward. The impact shook the chamber. The blast door sealed shut between them. Ronan stood there, wide-eyed, his breath ragged. What the hell was that? Nyx's glowing gaze flickered to him, something unreadable in her expression. Then, just as suddenly, the energy around her faded. She swayed. Ronan caught her before she collapsed. Secrets and scars. They stumbled into another corridor, this one dimly lit by the flickering remnants of emergency lights. Ronan lowered her against the wall, still shaken. "Okay," he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You want to explain what just happened back there?" "Because I'm pretty sure normal people don't," he gestured vaguely, "do that." Nyx remained silent, her breathing shallow. "Nyx," he pressed. Her eyes fluttered open. "It's part of me," she murmured. "Something I was never supposed to have." Ronan frowned. "What does that even mean?" She hesitated, as if weighing how much to say. Then, softly. "I was created, Ronan. The weight of the truth." His stomach dropped. "What?" Nyx's fingers curled into fists. "Not born. Created. Engineered in a facility like this one. Part of a failed experiment, one meant to harness something beyond what my people understood." Ronan felt his pulse pounding. "You're saying, you're some kind of weapon," she finished, bitterness lacing the word. Ronan stared at her, his mind struggling to process everything. Before he could respond, a distant boom shook the walls. Walker wasn't done. Ronan pushed aside the flood of questions clawing at his mind. "Can you stand?" Nyx nodded weakly. "Good," he said, forcing a grin. "Because I don't think we've got time for an identity crisis." She actually let out a breath of a laugh. And then, together, they ran. But Walker was coming. And this time, there would be no escape. No more running. A relentless hunter. The facility trembled around them, each explosion growing closer. Walker was not the kind of enemy that gave up, he was the embodiment of inevitability, a force that pursued without hesitation. Ronan could hear the distant thud-thud-thud of his heavy footsteps, reverberating like a heartbeat in the walls. Beside him, Nyx's breathing was labored. She was still weak from whatever power she had used earlier, but she pressed on, her jaw set with grim determination. Ronan didn't know how long they had before Walker caught up, but one thing was clear. They couldn't keep running forever. A desperate stand. They stumbled into a vast chamber, its high ceiling lined with massive steel beams. Old rusted machinery lay dormant, relics of a forgotten time. Ronan glanced around, searching for anything that could give them an advantage. "We can't outrun him," he said, turning to Nyx. "But maybe we can stop him." Nyx looked at him sharply. "You want to fight Walker?" Ronan forced a grin. "Not my best plan, I know." She exhaled, shaking her head. "You're insane." "So I've been told." Before Nyx could argue, a deep metallic groan echoed through the chamber. The blast door behind them buckled. Dust rained down from above. Then, with an ear-splitting boom, Walker burst through. The fury of a machine. He emerged from the dust like a nightmare, his massive form glowing with crackling red energy. His mechanical arm hummed with power, the jagged edges of his metal plating gleaming under the dim lights. "You've run far enough," Walker's voice rumbled. Ronan tensed. "We're not running anymore." Walker's eyes flickered to Nyx. "Then you accept your fate?" Nyx took a slow step forward, her violet eyes burning with defiance. "No," she said. "I'm changing it." The battle begins. Walker struck first. His arm shot forward with inhuman speed, a devastating punch aimed directly at Nyx. But this time, she was ready. She dodged, barely, twisting out of the way as the ground shattered beneath Walker's blow. Ronan moved in, darting behind the massive machine and unloading his stolen plasma rifle at point-blank range. The shots impacted, but Walker barely flinched. In a blur, Walker spun, his metal fist colliding with Ronan's chest. The air left his lungs. Ronan crashed into a rusted console, sparks erupting around him. Pain shot through his ribs, but he forced himself to stay conscious. Stay in the fight. Nyx's last stand. Nyx clenched her fists. The energy within her surged again, but this time, she controlled it. Her veins pulsed with power. She moved, faster than before, dodging Walker's attacks with unnatural speed. Then, she struck. A pulse of energy erupted from her palm, slamming into Walker's chest. For the first time, he staggered. But it wasn't enough. Walker roared, swinging wildly. His massive fist caught Nyx's side, sending her sprawling across the chamber. She hit the ground hard. Ronan's heart pounded as he saw her struggling to rise. Walker raised his arm again, ready to finish her. Ronan's choice. Ronan didn't think. He moved. His body screamed in protest, but he threw himself between Nyx and Walker, raising his rifle. He fired, emptying the last of his ammo into Walker's face. It did nothing. Walker reached forward, grabbing Ronan by the throat. The pressure crushed against his windpipe. "You are nothing," Walker growled. "A mere insect." Ronan gasped for breath, his vision fading. Then, a sudden pulse of heat. Nyx's hand shot up, glowing with raw power. She touched Valkyr's arm. Energy surged. Valkyr's entire body convulsed as the energy spread through his core, his circuits overloading. He let out a distorted scream. His grip loosened. Ronan hit the ground, coughing. He looked up, just in time to see Valkyr's red eyes flicker. Then die. Valkyr's massive frame collapsed. The ground shuddered as the war machine fell, smoke curling from his broken body. Ronan and Nyx stared at the unmoving husk. It was over. But the real fight had just begun. The price of freedom. A moment of silence. The chamber was eerily quiet. Valkyr's body lay motionless, his once glowing red eyes now lifeless. Tendrils of smoke curled from his metal plating, the scent of burning circuits thick in the air. Ronan coughed, his ribs aching as he pushed himself up. He glanced at Nyx, who was still on her knees, breathing heavily. "You okay?" His voice was hoarse. Nyx didn't answer right away. Her hands were trembling. She stared at them as if they belonged to someone else, the faint remnants of her power still flickering at her fingertips. I didn't know I could do that," she finally whispered. Ronan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't think Valkyr knew either." She let out a short, breathless laugh. It was the first sign of relief either of them had felt. But the moment didn't last. Because Valkyr may have been defeated, but they weren't safe yet. "The facility is falling apart." A deep groan echoed through the facility, followed by a violent shudder. Ronan's instincts kicked in immediately. "We need to move. Now." Nyx nodded, forcing herself to her feet. She was still weak, but she didn't complain. Together, they stumbled toward the exit. The walls trembled as more explosions rocked the facility. Pipes burst, spewing steam. Overhead lights flickered and died, plunging sections of the corridor into darkness. Ronan pulled up a holographic map from his wrist console. "Hangars this way," he said, leading the charge. They ran. The final obstacle. Just as the exit came into view, a security alarm blared. Ronan swore. "You've got to be kidding me." The automated defenses were still active. A pair of sentry drones emerged from the ceiling, their energy cannons warming up. Nyx tensed, but Ronan acted first. He grabbed the discarded plasma rifle from Valkyr's remains and fired. One drone exploded instantly. The second fired back. Ronan dove aside, barely avoiding the energy blast. Nyx, still exhausted, raised her hand, her power flickered but didn't ignite. Ronan gritted his teeth and shot again. Direct hit. The drone spiraled out of control before crashing in a burst of sparks. "We need to keep moving," Nyx said, grabbing his arm. Ronan didn't argue. The hangar, one last chance. They burst into the hangar. Ships lined the docking bay, but most were either damaged or locked down. Ronan's eyes scanned for something flyable. Then he spotted it, a sleek recon-class fighter. "That one," he pointed. But before they could move, a new figure stepped into their path. Commander Zaid. Nyx stiffened. No. Zaid was the highest-ranking enforcer of the Syndicate, a man known for his ruthlessness. He was tall, clad in sleek black armor, a high-energy blade humming at his side. "You really thought you could escape?" Zaid's voice was calm, almost amused. Ronan raised his weapon, but Zaid merely smirked. In a blink, Zaid moved. He was fast, too fast. Before Ronan could react, Zaid's fist slammed into his stomach. Ronan doubled over, pain exploding through his body. Nyx moved to help, but Zaid caught her by the wrist. "You are property of the Syndicate," he said coldly. "You will return to your place." Nyx's eyes flared with anger. And for the first time, her power surged without hesitation. A shockwave erupted from her body, sending Zayd flying across the hangar. He crashed into a cargo container, groaning. Ronan took the chance. He grabbed Nyx's hand, dragging her toward the fighter. The escape. They sprinted up the ramp, Ronan throwing himself into the pilot's seat. Nyx slammed the hatch shut behind them. The ship's systems came online with a low hum. Outside, Zayd was already recovering. Ronan punched the controls. The fighter roared to life. As Zayd raised his weapon, Ronan didn't wait. He launched. The ship shot forward, the hangar doors barely opening in time. They soared into the sky, leaving the collapsing facility behind. The price of freedom. Nyx slumped into the co-pilot's seat, exhausted. Ronan glanced at her. "We made it." She didn't answer right away. Her violet eyes stared out at the stars, at the infinite possibilities ahead. But there was no relief in her expression. Just quiet, unspoken fear. "Ronan," she whispered. He frowned. "What's wrong?" She looked at him, hesitating. "Zayd won't stop hunting me," she said. "And neither will the syndicate." Ronan exhaled. He knew she was right. This wasn't over. It was just beginning.